Welcome everybody to the African Doctoral Academy Masterclass. My name is Natalie Kavalik. I'm the Program Manager at the African Doctoral Academy, and I'm joined by our guest speaker, Professor Tim Gutterman. Professor Gutterman is an applied research methodologist specializing in general research design and mixed methods research. He is an associate professor and associate director of the Mixed Methods program at the University of Michigan, USA. His methodological interest is to advance rigorous methods of qualitative and quantitative and mixed methods research, particularly strategies for intersecting and integrating qualitative and quantitative research. He also conducts health services research with a focus on improving quality and safety using informatics technology. Prof. Gutterman will be speaking on the topic of introducing the foundations of mixed methods research. We will be opening the floor to questions after the presentation, so please feel free to ask your questions in either the chat or Q&A section of this masterclass, and my colleagues Luther and Francia will be assisting with the questions after the presentation. Just a reminder to everyone that is joining the session, it is being recorded and we will be making it available on our YouTube channel. The links can also be found on our website. So welcome again, and I will now hand over the presentation and platform to Professor Gutterman. So welcome. Thanks, Prof.
Thanks, Natalie. Thanks very much. Very nice to be here. And I'm really looking forward to our time here today to talk about mixed methods research, which I'm most passionate about as a methodologist. And thanks for that nice introduction. Throughout this talk, going forward, I'm going to share some of my research. So you'll hear some examples of what I've done, ways that I've applied mixed methods, and then also colleagues, ways that they've done it too. And I'm doing that because I want to try to make it a little bit more concrete by giving practical examples of how mixed methods is being used and really how mixed methods can be used. So without further delay, I just want to give us a working definition of what mixed methods is, just to make sure that we're sort of operating from a common point and a common framework. There are different definitions of mixed methods, different views of mixed methods, but generally when referring to mixed methods, we're thinking about collecting and analyzing both qualitative and quantitative data. So that's kind of the first step that's really important. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that is and what it means. And then the integration of the qualitative and quantitative research. And that's underlined for a reason. It's because it's really, really important. And in fact, that's what I'm going to stress throughout a lot of this talk. It's the bringing together of qualitative and quantitative data or methods or result that's really critical. And that's what defines mixed methods research. It's also how we get the most value out of mixed methods research, in my opinion. And that's what really can lead to new insights. It's a different way of thinking about your data and a different way of analyzing it by really bringing the two together. Mixed methods, in my opinion, though, is really a natural approach to decisions, to our everyday lives, actually, and then to inquiry and research, of course. So, if you think about the basic decisions that you might be making throughout the day, where to go, what book you might want to read. Anytime you look at reviews or look up reviews, you typically see a star rating. We could think of that as a Likert type scale almost. And then you often have comments that people have written in order to make a simple decision. Now, from a mixed methods perspective, that's a lot of what we're doing, but we have different sophisticated ways of actually bringing the quantitative and qualitative together, which we'll be focusing on. And the premise for doing mixed methods, so why we actually do this, is because often just a single source of data or a single type of data can really not explain something, especially when we have people involved. So, and the complexities that go along with that. So, there's only so much that we can do with a single type of data if we're examining issues related to healthcare, for instance. So of course we can look at numbers, but talking to patients, talking to providers and nurses and family members and others really gives us a more complete picture. In education, we can look at test scores, of course, we can look at achievement of learners, but talking to learners, gathering from their perspectives, talking to instructors, to leaders, to parents of children, again, gives a different perspective. And the examples sort of go on and on. If we're in business or engineering, agricultural work, where there are farmers behind crop science and what's happening. So that's the idea of using mixed methods, that we really need to integrate both forms of research in order to address more complex aims and complex research questions. I'm going to just start with an example, and this is from a study that I was a co-investigator on, in part of for a long time. So let me just go through the example, and then I'll sort of give a little caveat, just that in my opinion, the methods that we're talking about really apply across any discipline or any domain. But let's just start with this example. So in the US, about 300,000 people per year experience a cardiac arrest out of the hospital. So in the community setting, for instance. And sadly, about 90% of people do not survive that cardiac arrest that happens outside of the hospital. Now, what's really concerning about that, I mean, obviously that alone is concerning, but there is a large variation in survival rates across US communities. So if we look at how likely someone is to survive the cardiac arrest, go to the hospital, and then discharge alive, of course, the survival can vary 5 times across US communities. And you know, that means that if where I'm at right now in Ann Arbor, Michigan, if I'm in another community, I might have 5 times less chances of survival, for instance. And that's what's concerning, you know, that sort of variation that happens, which really, you know, should not be the case. So that's what we sought to address, this really complex problem, this really complex issue. And really, we wanted to know how the system of care works together in order to achieve a successful response to a cardiac arrest. So we used mixed methods in order to do this. And this was a large study, so there was a team that was involved with it. Quantitatively, we looked at registry data. So essentially, this is organizations that are reporting into this registry of cardiac arrests that happen outside of the hospital. And then through logistic regression, looked at basically standardized, and you see this term here, I won't get into jargon, but that's basically whether they had a pulse when they went to the hospital, when they arrived at the hospital. So that was kind of the first step, just to figure out what's the survival rate across these communities. So then based on that, we purposefully sampled different emergency medical systems across the state of Michigan. So we identified 4 that were higher performing. They had stronger survival rates, 2 that were kind of medium, and then 3 that were lower performing. And then again, that's based on you know, whether individuals had a pulse essentially when they arrived at the hospital. So in that qualitative portion, when we went to those 9 different systems across the state, we had focus group interviews. And that was really with members of this system to try to see how they interact and how they work together. We also had individual interviews with a lot of these members as well. So the interviews at each site, you know, we did maybe 10 to 12. And again, this is a large study, but, you know, don't get too hung up on the size. You know, even a smaller study would have been really important, in my opinion. And then we analyzed that data thematically. So then from a mixed methods perspective, we went back to the performance data, that initial quantitative results. And basically we compared the themes of the higher performing sites, the higher performing systems, and compared and contrasted that with the themes that we found at the middle and low performers. And that's what was really, really important, because that allowed us to distinguish or to try to extract what is it that's different about these high performing communities, these higher performing systems, and what sort of best practices can we glean from that. So ultimately, we took those results and we translated it to this toolkit, which is published. I won't spend a lot of time on this because it's sort of beyond our scope here. But basically, we looked across what you would call the chain of survival, and that's what you see through the top here at each of these columns. So, recognizing that there's a cardiac arrest, doing CPR, defibrillating, advanced care, and then hospital care. And again, it was based on that mixed methods analysis, figuring out what was different about high performing systems versus lower performing systems. We then included this series of themes which really informed the toolkit. So working as a team was important. Devoting resources to coordination was important. So the high performers really put a lot of effort into thinking about how do we get this team to work together as really a high performing team, as opposed to just a bunch of different entities who come together. And then developing a culture of continuous quality improvement. But we really arrived at this through a mixed method study and through mixed methods analysis. So it's an example, in my opinion, of the value of mixed methods. I don't believe that we would have been able to achieve this had we not had the quantitative data, because we wouldn't have been able to really compare and contrast and extract those best practices or promising practices. Similarly, I think that we would have been really remiss if we didn't have the qualitative data as well. I mean, I vividly remember interviews and stories we heard and learning about experiences from many of these individuals, and thinking about the fact that they operate in this very complex situation. There's a lot of nuance, and that's really why, in my opinion, we needed the qualitative piece as well. But then bringing them together, of course, is what allowed us to pull out these best practices. So in this example, obviously this is in healthcare, and this is kind of my disclaimer or caveat as well. If you think about these sorts of things that we learned here, most of these are really not about health or clinical sort of issues. I'm, myself not a clinician. I'm more of a social scientist who's approaching these kinds of studies. So the things that we learn were really, back to social science, honestly. Things related to organizations, psychology, and psychological safety came up in the study. Um, how teams work together, for instance. So I say that because as I'm going through these examples, I'm going to share examples of mixed methods across a variety of fields. Some will be in health sciences, some will be in other fields. But my opinion is that the methods we use are really discipline agnostic. So if this seems like a healthcare example and you're really in, agriculture or business or whatever, I would just challenge you to think about, can the methods apply to my work? And in most cases, I think they probably can. If you have questions at the end here about how this might apply, feel free to ask those. But I would ask you to just think about how they can apply to your discipline, your field. So with that introduction of an example, hopefully to sort of spark your appetite of what mixed methods is, here's just a little overview of what we'll be covering together. So I'm going to start with the characteristics of mixed methods, talking about really why it's valuable, just to study complex issues and new challenges, and then really focusing on integration, which is key to mixed methods and what's needed to design a mixed method study for integration. So starting with the characteristics of mixed methods research, and I'm going to go through each of these characteristics briefly in a little bit of detail. But basically, Cresswell and Plano-Clark, who are some of the more prominent and popular writers in mixed methods, they have a very nice book. They define mixed methods based on its characteristics. So first, we're collecting and analyzing both qualitative and quantitative data. We're using rigorous qualitative and quantitative methods. We're using a mixed methods design to guide the overall process of research. We are integrating the two forms of research, so that bringing together is what's really critical. And we often use some sort of a lens, and that can be a philosophical paradigm or a theory or a conceptual model. But let me break down each of these characteristics in a bit more detail. So first, I said we're collecting and analyzing both quantitative and qualitative data. So when I think of quantitative, I tend to think of data that's more closed-ended. So this can be data that we are collecting through things like surveys or instruments. So if you send out a survey with Likert type items and then you're compiling those, for instance, instruments that can be psychological tests, it could be medical test results. It's just another term for any kind of assessment you're using. Tests broadly speaking, tests of learners, educational tests, obviously tests in health, lab results, blood pressure readings, any of those kinds of numbers, tests that you're maybe doing, you're sampling environmental aspects in your community or water system or crops, whatever the case, anything where we're collecting more numeric data. And I say closed-ended because we're limited in our response options. So there's a range of potential scores that we're looking for on those tests. It could be observational checklists. So you're at a setting and you're recording instances of behavior, or you're checking yes or no whether something happened or not. So it's a very closed-ended observation, or gleaning numbers from reports. And this can be any kind of report. This can be in accountancy, you're reviewing corporate records and extracting financial numeric information from it. It could be reports from an electronic health record or educational record, for instance. So then to contrast that, qualitative data I tend to think of as more open-ended. So this can be done through more open-ended interviews, either individual or focus groups, where you're posing open-ended questions and then you're asking for a response. Your participant is constructing the response in an open-ended way. So tell me what it was like to return to school, for instance, and then they explain what that was like. Open-ended observation. So this is data where you might collect in a setting and you're writing detailed field notes about what you see, what you observe, what's going on, what interactions are looking like. Documents are another potential form of qualitative open-ended data, and I use this very broadly. So this can be looking at a participant journal or diary, they're collecting that. This can be policy documents, procedure documents you're analyzing. This could be data from an electronic health record, from clinical notes. And to extend this even further, it could be social media data. I have colleagues who, for instance, analyze data on Facebook, or I've been involved in Twitter, or now X data, it was Twitter at the time, extracting that and analyzing it. And then finally, things like audiovisual materials, so photographs or videos that we're looking at in an open-ended way. So that's kind of the first characteristic of mixed methods that we have qualitative and quantitative data. But then what's important to remember is that we're using rigorous methods of each. And what we tend to worry about more in mixed methods research, and this is based on systematic methodological reviews that have looked at the quality of mixed method studies. What we tend to worry about more is the qualitative component of mixed methods research. So a mixed method study is not, necessarily taking a large survey and adding an open-ended question. And I'm not saying that's a bad idea, but that single open-ended question would not really be rigorous qualitative methods compared to other forms of collecting qualitative data. So I think part of maintaining rigor is really respecting the intent of qualitative and quantitative research and respecting that they are different essentially. So qualitatively, we might be looking at meaning that individuals give to a phenomenon. What was it like to experience something? What was it like to return to school? What was it like to learn you have this diagnosis? What was it like to participate in this intervention, for instance? It could be really wanting to learn participants' views of what that is, really focusing on that. Quantitatively, we might be testing a theory or a hypothesis to look for evidence to support or refute it. So again, the intent is differently. We might be measuring a phenomenon, construct, or variable. And within a mixed method study, we have both of these intents operating. So each of these components, the qualitative and the quantitative, kind of need to stand alone in terms of their rigor. In terms of mixed methods designs, I won't go into this in depth now because I'm going to talk about designs more in a minute. But a design is meant to guide the overall process of research, the flow of procedures, really from start to finish. And that's helpful thinking about when we have qualitative components, when we have quantitative, when they're coming together. And the designs are also helpful thinking about how we're going to explain this, how we're going to write it up actually. So we have core designs and then complex designs where we're using mixed methods, maybe within like a intervention, a randomized controlled trial, or within community-based research, for instance. But I'll pause for now because we'll get into designs in a lot more detail very soon. So next, and this is really kind of the biggest one, and this is the integration of the two forms of research. So integration is what's critical to mixed methods. It's what I'm going to focus really the rest of the talk on. It's the central and then also the defining feature of mixed methods research. So if we have a study that has a qualitative component and a quantitative component, but we're not integrating the two, we're not bringing them together, I would not call that mixed methods research. I would call that multi-method research, honestly. So integration is what's really central to mixed methods. And it's this idea that we are intentionally combining qualitative and quantitative research so that they really become interdependent and intertwined with one another. And integration then leads to something new. It can lead to new inferences, which we call meta inferences. So these are new insights or claims we can make by bringing the two forms of often results together, or it can lead to new phases of research. So in the study that I started with, my example, we began with a quantitative study, and then we used that to systematically plan a qualitative follow-up. And we used it to inform what sites we were going to. We used it to inform what questions we were asking in the focus groups and interview guides. And then finally, the final characteristic is the use of philosophy or theory as a lens for what we're doing. And what's important here is if you are using philosophy or theory, that's then guiding what you do. So what I don't like to see is a theory or conceptual model just mentioned in the introduction, and then it sort of goes away, and you don't see anything else about it. If you are using a theory, it can be really helpful. It can be helpful in ways like guiding data collection and analysis, thinking about what data sources you're collecting. It can be helpful for guiding integration. And then similarly for philosophical worldviews. So for instance, if you have more of a social justice worldview or a community-based participatory approach, again, that can guide the entire process of research. Or action research, for instance, where you're really also working with participants, again, that can guide the entire process of research. So I want to now shift a little bit and focus the rest of our time on, what's the potential value of mixed methods, and then how do we design a mixed method study for integration specifically, which is critical. So first, I just want to acknowledge that there are different reasons that we conduct mixed methods research. And often it's just complex problems that require mixing of methods. So some reasons why we would do that: to understand how an outcome came to be. So, why is it, for instance, that a particular intervention is effective, or why is it that we see lower academic scores in the Republic of Georgia right now? Why is that happening? How did that come to be? Maybe it's to examine how a process or experiences vary based on a differential outcome. So if we look at high scoring individuals or sites versus lower scoring, does process maybe explain some of that? Are there different ways that these places are operating? Maybe instead we need to develop or adapt measures or intervention features. So maybe we have an instrument to measure something. Let's just say we have an instrument to measure burnout, but that's been developed in a UK population, and now we want to use it in um, Limpopo, for instance, and we want to make sure that it's culturally relevant, and we need to adapt that. Or maybe we have an educational test, and now we want to use it. I'll go back to the Republic of Georgia. We want to use it there. How do we need to adapt it or change it so that it's culturally relevant? Again, mixed methods could be a good use for that. Uh, Maybe it's to explain vague quantitative results using qualitative methods, or to develop and test theoretical models. So in order to, really uh, address some of these, big rationales for using mixed methods, we really need to think about integration specifically and what is needed to design a mixed method study for integration. So what and this is close to a paper that I have written with a colleague of mine, Melissa Minoyevich. But what we really believe is that what's helpful is centering integration, so keeping that at the forefront across multiple levels of research design as you're approaching your study. So I want to talk about 5 of these levels: the research question level, the design level, the methods level, the results level, and then during interpretation and reporting. I will also kind of say this just as a editorial comment. Obviously, I also review a lot of papers as a peer reviewer, in addition to my editorial work for my journal. I review for many other journals. I also conduct external reviews for theses and dissertations across the world. I review grants, both as a reviewer for a funding organization, or also, work with individuals as a consultant. So I see what I'm trying to get at is I see lots of feedback about mixed method studies, and I see lots of mixed method studies in many phases: at a proposal phase, whether it's for a PhD or a master's or a grant proposal. I see many manuscripts that are written, and the single biggest issue that I see, and this is based on my opinion and other reviewers' comments that I read, is just a lack of integration in mixed methods research. So by attending to these different levels, you will be far ahead of most individuals currently as they are conducting or proposing to do mixed methods research. Because again, without integration, we would question, is this really a mixed method study? So let's walk through each one of these levels in a little bit of detail. So first is integration at the level of the research question itself. So this means that we're writing aim statements or purpose statements or objectives or research questions that are really reflecting the need for integration. And these are just some very high level examples of what that could mean. So maybe it's what explains deviation from policy or guidelines. So that might be the core of an integrative mixed methods research question. Or maybe it's how does implementation explain outcomes, or how does process explain outcomes? So, you have an intervention and you want to know, is there something about how that's implemented that's explaining the results that you're seeing, the outcomes you're seeing? Or maybe your mixed methods question is trying to understand how experiences relate to outcomes. So are there differential experiences? So in one study that of mine, you'll see in a little bit, we were trying to teach medical learners empathic communication skills. And one of the analyses we looked at is, the experiences, did that seem to relate to outcomes? So was there a pattern where people who did really well in the intervention versus people who did not do so well, did their experiences seem different, and maybe that's explaining these outcomes. So all of these are potential. This is not an exhaustive list. There are, of course, other reasons or other intents for doing mixed methods, other types of research questions. But I would encourage you to sort of be in that mindset of thinking about what's a mixed methods research question or objective or aim? What do I really hope to accomplish by mixing, by integrating? So then I said we would get back to designs, and that's what I'm doing right here. So um, a mixed methods design, again, is sort of guiding the entire process of research. And the idea is to think about, not only when we have a qualitative or quantitative piece, but when and how they're coming together. So we often see this, and you'll see an example in a minute. We often draw out these procedures as a way to make it concrete. So again, going back to Creswell and Plano-Clark's definition, they propose that there are really these three core designs that are used in mixed methods: a convergent design, explanatory sequential, and exploratory sequential, which we'll look at next. But then we can also do something more complicated with that. So we can use those with an evaluation, a program evaluation, or an intervention like a randomized controlled trial or intervention development even. We could use these within a case study or participatory approach, and many other examples as well. So going through each of these, I'll start with a convergent design. This is what a lot of people think of who are newer to mixed methods when they think of mixed methods, but this is not the only way to approach it. But the idea of a convergent design is to really compare or relate quantitative and qualitative results for a better understanding. So each of these are really defined by their intent of what you're doing. In a convergent design, we sometimes think of this as kind of a single phase study. And what we're doing procedurally is we're collecting qualitative data and analyzing it. We're collecting quantitative data and we're analyzing it. So that's what these blue rectangles represent. So these are solely quantitative or qualitative components. And then we're bringing them together. We're merging them. and that's a form of integration. And the reason for doing so is to compare results or maybe look for patterns between the two. So now, having said this, generally the qualitative and quantitative are kind of independent of one another, but they can interact, and that's completely okay. So an example, perhaps as you are conducting your quantitative analysis, it might raise some questions and you might want to go back to your qualitative data. So there's sometimes some back and forth here that happens, and that's perfectly okay. But it's really this intent of a better, more complete understanding that defines a convergent design. The qualitative and quantitative data collection usually happen as in a similar time frame. It does not have to be at the exact same time. Time is really not part of the equation. But what I would worry about is if you, say, collected your quantitative data for a convergent design now, and then you're not collecting your qualitative data for another year. Did things happen in that time that are maybe adding bias to what you're seeing? Some applications, some reasons for doing a convergent design. We want to acquire quantitative trends, things like large numbers, the ability to generalize, along with the qualitative detail and nuance. And that's really what we need for a better understanding. Or maybe we want to validate our quantitative findings with qualitative that we're collecting in a similar time frame. Or we just want to expand our quantitative finding with open-ended data. So again, it's this intent of bringing them together for a more complete understanding. So we also have a couple of sequential designs that we could think about, and I'll start with explanatory sequential. So this is at least two different phases by definition, where we start quantitatively. We collect quantitative data, we analyze it, and then so that's what this first box is. And then we use that in a systematic way to plan this qualitative follow-up phase in phase two. And that's for the intent of better explaining or unpacking or understanding those initial quantitative results. And then we integrate as we're making an interpretation. So to go back to my first example from out of hospital cardiac arrest, that was really an explanatory sequential design. We started with that quantitative registry analysis. We then used those results to plan the qualitative follow-up phase, those site visits that we would do. We analyzed that. And then in this final integrative phase, that's where we looked at what was different and similar about the higher performing relative to the middle and lower performing systems in that case. So some applications, beyond what I just mentioned, maybe you need to just explain quantitative results in more depth. You want to understand, what explains that variation, or what explains statistical differences you see or that you did not see, for instance. Maybe you need to start quantitatively in order to identify participants that you want to study in more depth qualitatively. So many applications for this design. This is, in my opinion, one of the more straightforward mixed methods designs to implement in terms of just thinking about how you're integrating and where you're integrating. So then finally, there is the exploratory sequential design, and this is kind of just the opposite of what I've talked about before. This is a two or sometimes three-phase project where you start qualitatively. So that's what we see in this first box. And then we're starting by exploring qualitatively, I should say. And then we're using that to build to some kind of a quantitative feature. So that's the intent of the exploratory sequential design. So that quantitative feature, it could be we're developing an instrument. Maybe we're going to develop a topology, and then we're going to test it quantitatively. Maybe we're starting qualitatively, developing a theory, and then we're going to test it quantitatively. Or maybe we're starting qualitatively and we're going to use that to develop an intervention or modify an intervention or something like that. So those are common intents for the exploratory sequential design. And then you see this oval on the far right-hand side here, and that's, more integrative analysis that happens after you have all of those results, where you're sort of looking across everything. So we could think about then doing something that's more complex if you choose to look at it that way. But the idea is to intersect mixed methods designs with something else, like I mentioned program evaluation or implementation science or an intervention and so on. And these are just a few examples. All of these types of intersections are building on those core designs that I just talked about, but you're doing it within sort of this larger framework that you're intersecting. So I'm moving on then from the design level to the methods level and what exactly that means. So here we're talking about the methods where quantitative and qualitative can come together. And when I am saying methods, I'm talking about more of those techniques or procedures of research. So methods could be sampling methods, data collection methods, analysis methods. So data collection method, we're using surveys, online surveys, or we're conducting semi-structured interviews. Analysis could be we're doing descriptive analysis or regression analysis or qualitatively thematic analysis. So those are examples of methods that I'm talking about. So within a mixed method study, there are different options for integrating at the methods level. Again, depending on your research question, you're not necessarily using all of these approaches to integration, but these are some of the options. So for one, integration in terms of your sample timing and relationships, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Matching data sources is kind of a pre-integration step to prepare for mixed methods analysis. So thinking about what do I have quantitatively and qualitatively, and do I have commonality between the two? Connecting results through sampling, so using one form of research to inform the sampling of the other, or building one form of data collection based on the other's results. So let's walk through each of these, starting with integration through the sampling relationship. And I'll go through this fairly quickly, but the point here is that there are different ways to think about what your quantitative and what your qualitative sample are based on your research question. So they could be identical. So we have say participants, and we are going to collect qualitative and quantitative data from everyone. So we have an identical sample. It could be, to contrast that, more of what we would say a nested or enlarged sample. So one is basically a subset of the other. So most commonly, and this is probably the most common way that sampling happens in a mixed method study, we have a larger quantitative sample, and our qualitative sample is a subset, a subgroup within that. Now, thinking about a convergent design, that's often what happens. Thinking about an explanatory sequential design, we start quantitatively, and then we're using qualitative to explain those results. This is also what typically happens. This is what happened in our out-of-hospital cardiac arrest study. We could potentially have entirely separate samples, usually, from the same population. But an example here would be, let's say we're developing an instrument, and we want to start qualitatively by talking to individuals about what's important to them, and then we're going to develop a survey. Well, we would want to test that with a different group of individuals, people who haven't been exposed to it through the interviews. We could also have multi-level samples. So one study that I'm also an investigator on right now, we are looking at variation in hospital infections after a cardiac surgery. So we're sampling at multiple levels. We are considering the level of the community. So, what city or town these surgeries are happening in. We're thinking about the health system. There are large health systems that have often multiple hospitals within the health system. We're sampling at the level of the hospital itself. And then within the hospital, we're thinking about who do we need to talk to? We need to talk to nurses on the floor, critical care nurses, surgeons, of course, physicians and other providers in the ICU, or those who are taking care of patients, and then patients and caregivers themselves. So there are multiple levels. It's a complex and large study, and we really need to account for all of those levels. So that's sampling through the sampling relationship. Matching then is this idea that we want to plan ahead for integration by ensuring that we have similar concepts qualitatively and quantitatively that we are collecting. And again, it's a way to sort of prepare for integration. So I'll share an example of this. And this is a study by Ellen Mosholm in Denmark, and she was interested in quality of life as people were going through a workup for a potential cancer diagnosis. So this is what I would call a joint display, this table, and this is just an excerpt from the paper. On the left-hand side, we have survey items, and I should say this was a convergent design from a quality of life measure. It was a European quality of life measure. And, this is just an excerpt, but we see on the left-hand side here, this is organized by domains. We have emotional functioning, and then the series of questions. We have social functioning, a couple questions, quality of life, and a few questions. So then on the right-hand side, these are the interview questions that she was asking in these individual semi-structured interviews. And the idea is that it's really planned in a systematic way. So for these questions on emotional functioning, she was asking this qualitative question: would you describe how you emotionally were affected during the diagnostic process? Note, the match doesn't have to be one-to-one. She has one question for this series of items, but then if you look down, some of these are more one-to-one. But it's really just being thoughtful and planning ahead. What do you want to collect quantitatively and qualitatively, and matching those? And in this case, it really prepared her well for integration and for that integrative analysis that was coming. All right, so integration through connecting. This is another form of integration at the level of methods, where we're using one form of research to inform sampling for the other. So we're going to use quantitative results to identify who we want to talk to, for instance. Here's an example. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but this is by Matt McCrudden and Aaron McTeague. They were looking at beliefs about climate change among high school students. So they started with this survey. They ended up basically grouping into people who were more objective and less objective in terms of their beliefs about climate change and arguments about climate change. And ultimately, they used those groups in order to select the qualitative sample. So they wanted to sample people in the more versus the less objective group. So building then is the final form of integration at the methods level before we move on to the results level, where one type of research is informing the data collection approach of the other. So for example, we might be using qualitative results in a very systematic way in order to develop a survey. So let me just show an example of what that could look like. So we have our qualitative results, and we're using those to inform the quantitative survey. So themes are informing what are the major scales or the major sections on my instrument. Qualitative codes, we're using codes to identify the variable that are core to each of the items or questions on this instrument. And then we're using quotes to actually inform the item writing itself. So we're using the words of participants as opposed to our language as researchers, which is really, really important. It's using the language of your audience ultimately. And here is a very nice example of that. This is a study by Michelle Howell-Smith and colleagues. This was actually her dissertation. She was interested in examining basically for individuals who were seeking a PhD in engineering, what explains their interest? How do people become interested in an engineering PhD? And I was really addressing this critical issue that there were a lack of individuals, as I understand, who were going into academia to teach future engineers. So this was an exploratory sequential study. She started with a qualitative grounded theory phase and then used that to develop an instrument in order to test that theory in a few different ways. So this is another example of a joint display. So on the left-hand side, we see constructs and also subconstructs from those qualitative results. We also see quotes, direct quotes from individuals. And then on the far right-hand side, we see the resulting item on this instrument. So I won't read through this to you and happy to make these slides available, but this is really demonstrating that systematic process of integration, building integration at the methods level, where those qualitative results were informing this survey. They were informing the data collection, what's actually going to be on this survey. So I want to move on now and talk about integration at the results level. So, typically what we think about at the results level is merging as an integration strategy or the form of integration. So we are comparing results or perhaps relating results to look at patterns. And I'll explain what I mean by each of those. But the idea is that we are generating something new. So we're generating new meta inferences, is the term we often use in mixed methods. And it could be by looking at intervention benefits and experiences. So outcomes and experiences, or outcomes and process, just to give you a few examples, and how bringing those together can really generate these new insights or claims. So merging is really, in my opinion, in many individuals, the hallmark of a high quality mixed method study. Of course, we won't know how they merge until after we collect data and after we analyze data. But we can plan for integration by thinking about what are our research questions, what are our data sources, and so on. Merging is something that can happen in any of the designs that I've talked about as well. Merging through comparison is this idea that we're bringing qualitative and quantitative results together really in an iterative fashion. So we're comparing stories to numbers and themes to scales. We're thinking about, do they confirm or contradict one another or sort of expand our understanding? And then we use that to develop meta inferences. So I'm going to show you yet another example of a joint display. And this is, moving into reporting, of course. This is a published joint display, but I think it kind of illustrates this cognitive process of merging. Now, this was a study where I was interested in experiences with telehealth. This was based on physicians' views. There's a companion study looking at patients' perspectives. So on the left-hand side here, I have quantitative results from one of our scales on a survey. And this, I should say, was an explanatory sequential design. And this was whether communication was adversely affected through video visits, telehealth visits for these different groups of individuals. So we put that side by side with the related qualitative results. So thinking about some different groups for whom communication is affected, both positively and negatively, and then ultimately using that to develop the meta inferences, which is what you see in the final column. So I won't read through this, but just to give an example here. So if we look down, I found this kind of interesting. So sort of at the bottom in our quantitative, patients with physical disabilities. So most physicians, are they rated, I would say, rather highly that they would be adversely affected by video visits. So then qualitatively, this was one of the findings. Patients with physical disabilities or limited mobility could actually benefit where access to care would be a challenge. But for some, really they need physical assistance in order to even complete the visit. So putting that all together, although the survey indicated communication is generally not affected for these patients, the qualitative results indicated situations in which it was not sufficient. So it was really, kind of a mixed bag, thinking about what specific disabilities, so if it was hearing or vision versus physical versus cognitive and so on. And then qualitatively, we learned instances where it was positive and instances where it was negative. So it really kind of expanded the understanding. It really sort of explained what we were seeing in the quantitative results and some of that variation. So then I have just, kind of a template for how you might actually do this, where you have a column for your qualitative results, a column for your quantitative results, and then the meta inferences. It could be organized by domains, by themes, but it's really a process of making a comparison and then using that to develop meta inferences. So merging through relating, it's kind of the last integration strategy I'll go through as we're kind of winding down to the end here. Relating is this idea that we're looking for patterns. It's kind of like a cross tabulation or a contingency table, if you're familiar with the statistical term. But the idea of merging through relating is to look at themes by statistics or statistics by themes. And I'll show an example so you can see what I'm talking about. So this is a study that I mentioned just briefly about trying to provide training on empathic communication. We were using virtual humans in order to do so. So this is sort of an interactive software. So in this way of relating, should say what we were doing is we were just focused on the intervention group, even though we had a sizable control. But within the intervention group, there was clearly a distribution. So we had low performers, we had middle performers, and high performers. So we related that to these themes that you see. So we have, again, the quantitative as these columns, and we have our qualitative themes here as rows. And this is just kind of an abbreviation of what the actual theme is. The paper has more detail. But, I'll just point out a couple of things that were interesting. And it makes a lot of sense, but we wouldn't have been able to do this without integration. So for the low performers, if you look down at this theme of motivation to learn more, we really had no related comments. So none of the low performers were interested in learning more about empathic communication. The middle and high performers were, and I have some illustrative quotes. It would be interesting to go through other scenarios to see if this actually has a positive effect on my future interaction with patients. So, that's really helpful to know. I mean, it shows there's a group of people who did not do well in the intervention. They're also not motivated to learn anything more about this relative to the other groups. So how does the intervention need to change? Do we need to do some pre-work for these individuals? Do we need to do some screening and maybe they would have another intervention instead? It's actually really helpful to have this systematically to think about how to make those changes going forward. So again, just demonstrating the intellectual process, I have this template where you might have a column for higher scoring and lower scoring. I had 3 columns in the last example. And then for each theme, you're making a comparison to develop meta inferences. But then you can also look sort of down across these groups to develop meta inferences. So across themes, what does a high scoring individual look like? Or what does a low scoring individual look like? So that's kind of the intellectual process of developing meta inferences. And the goal of developing meta inferences, of course, is to create a compelling narrative. The onus is always on you. And I have both results and interpretation reporting highlighted at the top here because we're sort of we're straddling into reporting. But the goal, the onus is on you to report integrated results in a mixed method study. So meta inferences, developing those meta inferences are really critical. These are new claims that integrate things into a coherent whole. And without this, you're really, in my opinion, not leveraging the value of mixed methods. So this integration can happen in a few different ways through a narrative. So this is what we learned statistically, and this is what we learned qualitatively. And these are our meta inferences. We could also use these joint displays as a tool to develop meta inferences, as we've seen. And then I also will mention that software can be really valuable for developing meta inferences as well. So here's just to close a final example of another joint display that you might use. In most of these examples I've shown, I have a graphic for showing the quantitative results. You don't have to, I would say more commonly it's sort of a bulleted list, but I find the graphic to be helpful. But here we have attitudes from a quantitative measure juxtaposed with qualitative results, and then the meta inferences in the right-hand column. So again, just a few examples of how you can report these in a joint display. So we've talked about centering integration through multiple levels of the research design, and I'm just going to end with this slide here just to sort of organize what some of these tools are. Hopefully you find this helpful. We've talked about the research question level, so writing research questions or objectives or aims that reflect the need for integration. We've talked about the design level, focusing on convergent, explanatory sequential, and exploratory sequential designs, though I also mentioned intersected designs. We've talked about methods level integration, so really bringing together those procedures, whether it's sampling or matching your data sources, connecting using one form of research to plan the sample for the other, building using one form of research to plan data collection for the other. We've talked about integration at the results level through merging in a couple of different ways, and then just briefly reporting. So writing a narrative using joint displays. And I would say that I prefer joint displays, but I also like joint displays because I feel like once you create a joint display, it's then actually easier to write the narrative. It gives you a way to structure your results section, reporting your mixed method results. And then I just, briefly mentioned the value of software. Here are a few recommended readings on integration. This first one, Fetters, Curry, and Cresswell, they talk about major strategies for integration. This last one is what much of this is based on. It's in a health journal, BMJ Quality and Safety. I just want to encourage you that even if that's not your field, and health is actually not my field. I come from, again, a social science background. I would encourage you to think about looking at some of these resources and thinking about how they can apply to your work. And then finally, I just have a lot of references from the examples that I shared as well. But with that, let me stop talking for a little bit, and I hope we still have some time for questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Natalie. Thank you, Professor, for that insightful session. So I'm going to be going through the chat. We do have a couple of questions and comments, starting with this one. I am using a fully mixed sequential dominant status design. Is there any guidance for this approach?
Yeah, so good question. I mentioned there are different definitions of mixed methods, different terms. So, and you're, using not the Cresswell and Plano-Clark format, but more something that Boozy would use, or Johnson and colleagues, which is fine. They're all excellent scholars. I just want to sort of translate a little bit. So, or Creamer, she would use that too. But fully mixed is this idea that you're not just integrating at a time point. You're really integrating throughout. And I would say that's really pretty consistent with what I have tried to stress here. So you're thinking about mixing at various levels, from the very early stages of planning all the way through how you're actually reporting your results, for instance. So, I think going through each of these levels and really attending to each of these levels would be helpful. At least I think it would be helpful in terms of what you're doing. In terms of the kind of the dominant, non-dominant, there are there are different opinions. There are some mixed methods researchers who think about sort of, which the qualitative or the quantitative, which one has more emphasis or which one has more priority on it. That is just not part of how I think about mixed methods and what I do. I respect that opinion, but it's just not part of how I actually approach mixed methods. So I would say that if you are, but of course I see lots of papers in the journal that do. So I would say what's important is to write about, how or in what way that is dominant. And this kind of is true for everyone. So if you have more of a qualitative emphasis or dominance on your study, thinking about how exactly that is and how that's going to come forward. So is that just a way of thinking, the fact that we're valuing participant perspectives and it's really more constructing knowledge, for instance, but really ensuring that that's kind of at the forefront and you're also making it really clear for the reader how that's dominant, in what way it is, and why that's useful to you. There's a few things that come to mind too in terms of resources. It's more on the qualitative side. It is on the qualitative side, but there is a really good paper by Cheryl Poth and Peggy Shannon Baker, and it's about qualitatively oriented mixed methods research. It's open. I can find the reference and share it. It is open access. It's published in the International Journal of Qualitative Methods, but I would think about that resource also as maybe being helpful.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Another question that just came in. So this person says, I have a 3-paper design for my PhD that has a sequential mixed method design. All papers feed into the design of the instruments of the next paper. Paper 1, qualitative secondary. Paper 2, quantitative survey. And then paper 3, qualitative interviews. And this person asks, what should I watch out for?
Great question. I'll come back to integration. So I would say that it's, often in all mixed method studies, not just a 3-paper PhD, but we just have to separate into multiple papers because there's too much to put into a single paper. So we do think about that, and you've proposed just kind of a very traditional way of thinking about that you're going to separate quantitative papers and qualitative papers. The issue to watch out for, in my opinion, is that in doing it that way, you run a strong risk of sort of missing integration. So it can be, you can sort of lose sight of the fact that we're actually all part of a single mixed method study. And I mean, this is a challenge of mine too when I split out papers. So, aside from just saying that, paper 1 is part of a larger mixed method study, and then your survey paper, this is part of a larger mixed method study. How do you really relay the integration that happened and the value of integration? At a simple level, it's of course cross-referencing all 3 of those papers. The other thing that I might encourage you to think about is how you could maybe bring some integration into each of these papers. So the fact that each one led to the next, for instance. So, how could you do that? It could be in paper 3, for instance, and I'm just giving an example. I could think of examples for all of these, but maybe in paper 3 in your method section, you have a subheader. You've said that this is part of a mixed method study, but you have a subheader within your method section, and you're calling it something like mixed methods integration or development of the qualitative interviews. And you write a paragraph where you discuss how you systematically use those quantitative survey results to plan this interview phase. And that could have been connecting through sampling, so how you use that to purposively sample people. It could be more of a building procedures. So how you use those survey results to plan what interview questions you would ask in the semi-structured interview. So to kind of summarize, the thing to watch out for is just losing sight of the mixed methods aspects and making it clear that you did integrate in mixed methods. So trying to at least weave some of that into each of these papers that you've outlined here is my best recommendation for you.
Okay, thank you very much for that response, Professor. We also have Fred here, who seems to be seeking confirmation on something. And Fred is asking, so then having an exploratory data analysis, EDA, is better to precede the quantitative data with mixed methods approach, or vice versa?
I may need to explain that a little bit more. I mean, what you mean by exploratory data analysis, I guess. For an exploratory sequential design, exploratory sequential mixed methods design, you would start with a qualitative phase, and then you would use that to inform a quantitative follow-up phase. But I'm not sure if that's exactly what you're asking.
Okay, perhaps Fred would like to provide more context on that question. But then whilst Fred, you're typing, I'm going to move on to the next one. And this person asks, which design is good for large qualitative data and small quantitative data? And I think Fred has his hand up. So we'll probably go back to Fred after you've responded to this one, I guess.
Sure. And just to clarify, did you say large quantitative data and small qualitative?
Vice versa, large qualitative data and small quantitative data.
Large qualitative. That's a good question. I mean, typically, and this isn't always the case, but it's sort of in a sequential design what you start with. So I would say if you have a larger qualitative phase and you're starting with that, it might be more of an exploratory sequential study. Not always the case, but often it's what people lead with. And conversely, and I mean, these are all generalizations. Of course, there's exceptions to all of this, but I would say if you have a large quantitative data set and smaller qualitative, that tends to be more of an explanatory sequential mixed methods design. But that's just what generally happens. You can always have a rationale for doing something different.
Another question. How do you ensure that the qualitative and quantitative components of a mixed method study are given equal weight rather than defaulting to one as merely supportive?
That's a great question. I mean, I personally just don't worry about weight at all. I mean, I know some do, but I really don't think about that or worry about that. I mean, for me, it's sort of hard to go in with this perspective that I want equal weight or I want more qualitative or more quantitative, because you really don't know what's going to be more important until you've actually analyzed your data quantitatively and qualitatively and from an integrative perspective. So that's kind of my reason for not putting too much focus on the weighting or the emphasis, whatever you want to call it. Having said that, I think one way to try to counterbalance that and make sure you're not losing sight of one or the other is going back to ensuring you have a rigorous approach quantitatively and qualitatively. So you've maintained the intent of your qualitative research and your qualitative. So if it's exploring a phenomenon or if it's to generalize quantitatively, you're really doing what you need to do so that each one of those is rigorous. You have planned for integration, and in integration, you're not really privileging for the most part one or the other, but you're considering each of those kind of alone as standalone as you're merging or as you're integrating. And then I would just go back to keeping kind of at each of those levels, if you want to ensure equal emphasis, just ensuring that you're not losing sight of either the qualitative or the quantitative as you're really thinking about integration and as you're planning your study. But very good question.
Okay, thank you very
Hello?
much. Fred seems to be unmuted. Fred, you can go ahead.
Yes. All right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Prof. It has been a very good presentation. Without wasting time, I would like to do some clarification on this. I was asking if the exploratory data analysis is the mixed method approach you are meaning, because initially sometimes you do exploratory data analysis before you go even on the ground to do the qualitative. So I'm wondering whether the EDA can be done first, then also when you now go to do the real data collection, or actually after getting your variables, then also during the last data collection, you do still the survey, and then also you mixed. I'm getting a little bit worried there. To summarize it all, in the modern research, people do exploratory data to first get up the gist of the matter, to readjust their theories. Then when you go to collect the ultimate data, you may, I'm now wondering whether you can still do mixed method at that last time, or the exploratory data results is enough. Then my second other question was about the integration of the results, especially now in whether it's not relative with the universities. Can one present his results in the way you have mentioned, thematically, and also in a design way in any university, or this one now varies from one university to the other? That's why that's what I wanted to know. That's as my second part of the question. The first one is a bit confusing. Yes, Prof. The first one is a bit confusing. I will be grateful if you have got it well. The EDA is used initially in other researches to get you to align your theories, your research questions. Then you will have gotten the variables very well. Then when you go to collect data on finally on the ground, you also have to mix them in case you're doing quantitative data. Do you have to still mix them, or the information you got from the exploratory data analysis is enough to justify or to triangulate as a mixed approach? Thank you.
Good question. I mean, so I'm really not familiar with EDA. I mean, it sounds like what I would call a pilot study, and that sort of pilot work or preliminary work is all another term that I might use. Is something that you could use in quantitative, qualitative, or mixed methods research. I mean, to me, the issue is whether it would be valuable to integrate that, and whether it would be valuable to bring it together. So, I mean, in one sense, I could see if you're thinking about, say, an exploratory sequential study, and you're starting qualitatively, and that's what you're considering your exploration in order to identify those variables and refine theories and that sort of thing, and then you're moving to a quantitative phase, then that is integration within an exploratory sequential design. If instead, though, it's more very preliminary pilot work, and or as you said, EDA, and you have a lot to sort of test out, looking at feasibility and that sort of thing, but it's not going to be systematically integrated, or it wouldn't be valuable to do so, then I would kind of keep that separate and refer to it more as preliminary data, or as pilot data, for instance. So I hope that addresses the question. And then the other one was in terms of university differences. And I mean, of course, there are differences within countries and across countries in terms of expectations for a PhD. I would say that what I've shared is the state of the art thinking and that's been endorsed by, numerous textbooks and guidelines and supervisors and funding bodies in terms of what a mixed method study is. And that would really mean that you're reporting your integrated results. And without that, I think we would question whether it is a mixed method study. So in my opinion, it does apply. This is more of the state of the art of the science. Sometimes we need to convince supervisors and mentors and committee members. So I think, finding examples in your field is one strategy of mixed methods that have been done, and share that so they can see examples and relate it to what they would do. So that might be one recommendation if you need help with that.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Alima. You can go ahead with your question.
Well, thank you very much. This is Alima from Uganda. I like the presentation and the use of the examples you are giving. I need clarification. I am doing a quasi experiment, and then I also have, I have 3 objectives, and then one objective is to be like I'm supposed to use an ethnographic study design where we'll basically understand the culture of the people. And then the 2 objectives are the ones where I am doing a quasi experiment where I've designed an education intervention for young people. And then now we'll have like baseline statistics, and these people are going to be like their own controls. It's like a before and after experiment where you want to see if there is a change in their behavior. So my supervisor says, like, I do an ethnographic study design, which is qualitative. And then he says, for the other, you maintain that you're doing a quasi experiment. So in my proposal, as I write, like someone thinks, another supervisor says, this is a mixed methods design. And then the other supervisor says, no, it is not a mixed methods design. You state that you are doing, you have your 3 objectives, and your first objective is going to be a qualitative approach, which is an ethnographic study design. And then the other 2 objectives, you're doing a quasi experiment. So now I am confused. I don't know, like, do I treat it like it is a mixed methods design that is explanatory in nature? No, exploratory in nature, where you first do like the qualitative, then the qualitative informs the experiment that is going to be conducted. But now these are 2 people. One says maintain mixed methods design, then the other one says it is not mixed. You are doing ethnographic study design to meet objective 1, then you're doing a quasi experiment to meet objective 2 and 3. So kindly guide me.
Well, I'm sorry you're getting conflicting views. That's frustrating. In my opinion, what you've described is sort of an ideal mixed methods design. I don't know why you would keep them separate. I mean, to me, starting with that ethnographic approach would be really critical to inform the quasi-experiment that you're then doing after. And then I would think you have more opportunities for integration after you have those pre-post results to compare what you've learned with your original ethnographic study. So, sometimes with mixed methods, we think of, is there a chance to sort of mine our data further? So beyond what we learned qualitatively, so in your case, ethnographically, beyond what we learned quantitatively, in your case, through the pre-post quasi-experiment, and we learn more if we allow those to interact. And I can't imagine why that would not be helpful in your case. I don't know why you would not want to take advantage of the ethnographic study to plan what happens next and then look at all of your results together. I think sometimes people who are less familiar with mixed methods maybe get a bit nervous about it. I've also seen supervisors sort of discourage mixed methods because they're less comfortable with it and they're maybe concerned you won't follow those the procedures for a good mixed method study, but in your case, it seems like a really good use of mixed methods. And I think if you are putting a lot of attention to integration, and you described as you're thinking about integration, then in my opinion, it sounds like a mixed method study would be ideal for what you're doing.
Okay,
Yeah, that's
thank
helpful.
you. Thank you very much, Prof. Keeping the time in mind, Eleanor, you can go ahead and unmute yourself, but just remember just remember the clock, please. So if you could be concise, we'd really appreciate that. You can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to ask my question. My name is Eleanor. I'm a pediatrician working with the Ministry of Health in Uganda, and I'm doing a PhD using a mixed method design, which is explanatory sequential. My first objective will be looking at uptake of differentiated service delivery models, and then I'll do barriers and facilitators to understand why there's low uptake and for which populations. And then I'll take the findings from the first two aims into a human-centered design to try and develop models that are more suitable for my target population. One of the questions I keep getting for both objective 2 and 3 is that my qualitative aspect of my proposal needs development, especially on how I'm going to analyze my data. And what I had written in there was simply that I would code theme. So I wanted to get some tips on how I can improve the analysis of my results for both the second and third aim. So in summary, how best can I tips on how to analyze the qualitative objectives of aim 2 and aim 3? Thank you very much.
Very good question. I would say, think about a specific approach to qualitative analysis that you could use. So, typically, if you're doing interviews, for instance, we would record the interviews, transcribe them, and then we're analyzing the transcript. So if you're doing that, I would give that detail. And then, in terms of themes, I would, pick an approach. So for example, Brown and Clark have a number of papers and chapters on what they call reflexive thematic analysis, which is probably the most popular approach to thematic analysis. And it's this idea of coding your data. So you review the data and you apply codes to segments of text. This is a unit of meaning. You continue to refine those codes. You then think about what are themes, so larger patterns, and then you develop themes, and these are kind of the major findings or takeaways, and you continue to refine those themes. Of course, they have entire papers, even a book now, chapters that discuss this. I'm just giving you a few minutes, a short excerpt of what I might include in the method section, but I would describe that in a lot more detail and then ideally follow it. And let me just put their names in the chat just because, so it's not mispronounced. Brown, whoops. So I would write more about that approach for your qualitative analysis. And then for the mixed methods analysis, think about some of the things that I've shared here today. I would say if you could go to either of those articles that I mentioned, the one by Fetters, Curry, and Cresswell, or my article in BMJ Quality and Safety, and cite that and follow some of those procedures when talking about integration for the third phase, or how you're using those results to plan the human-centered design. I would recommend that you do that, and that would go into a lot more, just add a lot more detail, and I think that might reassure your people. And I actually just misspelled Brown and Clark, I realize. A-U-N and Clark. There's an E at the end. I've noticed a few questions. Yes, email me. I'm also happy to share slides, and I think they'll make this recording available too. I'll share slides. I can send the article that I mentioned if that would help. Just don't hesitate to reach out.
Okay, thank you very much. So we will pop your email in the chat, and we've seen a lot of questions. Then maybe they can do a follow-up with you. Thank you very much, Professor.
Of course.
Yeah. So again, thank you to everybody for joining. A very big thank you to Prof. Gutterman again, and also thank you to my two colleagues for helping this whole session, Luther as well as Francois. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks for having me.